You know, when I was going over this talk, I thought, you know, a lot of this may not seem that relevant to you guys because we're talking about a lot of events that happened a long time ago in American history. But I suppose you're hearing about that a lot anyway at Camp Constitution, so it's probably not a big change. But if some of you fall asleep, that'll be okay, I'll understand. But to make it a little more interesting, you might think of it as you're getting the inside scoop on certain areas of American history. We're going to look at some things that a lot of people don't get a chance to hear about. We're going to start with wars and how we got into them. And a lot of you probably know that we got into World War II after the Japanese attacked our fleet at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. The disaster. The Japanese sank or heavily damaged 18 warships, including 8 battleships. Destroyed a couple hundred planes on the ground and had over 2,000 Americans dead and many more wounded. And I think the big question Americans had was the day after Pearl Harbor. What do you think was on people's minds?
Why did they attack?
Well, why did they attack, or also how could we be caught off guard like this? You know, how could America allow this to happen? How did this disaster occur? Well, President Franklin D. Roosevelt appointed a commission to investigate the issue of Pearl Harbor and why we were caught off guard. It was called the Roberts Commission, and it was headed by the guy in the middle, a Supreme Court Justice named Owen Roberts, who was friendly with the president. And this is what you might call a Washington-friendly group. Admiral Reeves over here had been given a job in Lend-Lease by the president, who's a retired admiral. And the 2 Army generals, McNarney and McCoy, one was on the staff of the Army Chief of Staff, George Marshall, and the other was his close personal friend. Now this commission conducted 3 weeks of hearings, a couple days in Washington, and then they did almost 3 weeks in Hawaii. And then they issued an official report. In this report they said that Washington did its job. They were on the money before Pearl Harbor, and all the fault, they said, lay with our commanders in Pearl Harbor, namely Admiral Husband Kimmel, the Pacific Fleet Commander, and General Walter C. Short, who was the Army commander in Pearl Harbor. They said that these men were guilty of dereliction of duty. They failed to take adequate surveillance measures of the waters surrounding Pearl Harbor. Now the words dereliction of duty appeared on newspaper headlines all across America. These guys got inundated with hate mail, death threats. Members of Congress stood up and said these men should be shot. They're responsible for the deaths of thousands of Americans. Now Kimmel and Short protested the findings of the Roberts Commission. They pointed out that they weren't allowed to have their own attorneys present. They were denied the right to ask questions of witnesses. This testimony taken was initially unsworn, and much of the information they found was missing in the final report. So they asked something that almost no military officer ever asked. They asked, let us be court-martialed. We want to be court-martialed because we know it'll be done in a real courtroom with standard rules of evidence. But the President of the United States, Franklin D. Roosevelt, said no. No court-martials. The matter's been solved. We're at war now. These guys have already been relieved of their duties. So what good could a court-martial do? But Kimmel and Short kept pressing their case, and so did Congress, because Congress wanted the court-martials too. Then in 1944, when the war is nearing its end, Congress finally mandated, they said, we've got to have these trials. We're winning the war now. What's the big deal about letting these guys have their day in court? So in 1944, the Naval Court of Inquiry and the Army Pearl Harbor Board convened. Now at these hearings, the attorneys, the lawyers for Kimmel and Short, presented undeniable evidence that Washington knew all about the Pearl Harbor attack before it happened, but did not inform our commanders in Hawaii. Now, the admirals on the Naval Court of Inquiry, when they heard the evidence, they threw their pencils on the floor. Admiral Kimmel was completely exonerated, and they laid all the blame on Washington. They didn't name the president, because it was beyond their jurisdiction, but very clear who they were implicating. And the Army Pearl Harbor Board reached the same conclusion, and here are the closing words of its report. Up to the morning of December the 7th, 1941, everything that the Japanese were planning to do was known to the United States. Now, how do you think the public reacted to this? They reacted to the condemning of Kimmel and Short with hate mail and death threats. How do you think they reacted to their exoneration? They didn't react, because the President of the United States thought that these reports must be held top secret. So the public didn't learn the truth, but after the war, certain people tried to tell the people the truth. Now, a number of books appeared. Here's one that appeared in 1954, The Final Secret of Pearl Harbor, by Rear Admiral Robert Theobald, who was in Pearl Harbor commanding destroyers on the day of the attack. But these books didn't get noticed in the big public, didn't get no big reviews in the New York Times, and for the most part, the public wasn't aware. The breakthrough came when this book was published by John Toland. They call him the Dean of World War II historians. at this point, more witnesses come forward and documentation become available that had not been available at the time of the court-martials. Following this, the New American Magazine asked me to do a long article on Pearl Harbor and foreknowledge of the attack. And following that, the BBC, British Broadcasting Corporation, produced this documentary, which you can buy online, Sacrifice at Pearl Harbor, which repeated everything we said in the New American that Tolan had said. And some of you might be wondering, well, Mr. Perloff, you're talking about Washington knowing about the Pearl Harbor attack. How could they know that? Well, they knew through several means. One was the Purple Code. Now, this was Japan's diplomatic code, the secret code they would use to send messages to their embassies around the world, right? It was so complex, it had to be created by a machine and then translated by a machine, and the Japanese were convinced it couldn't be broken. But we had some great cryptographers, code breakers in Washington. They cracked that code in 1940. So in 1941, when relations with Japan were really tense, our War Department was translating Japan's messages on a same-day basis. And every day those messages went to the President of the United States and top members of his cabinet, and including General George Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff. Now, what did these messages reveal? They revealed that the Japanese had told the Germans to get ready because war was about to begin. They told their embassies and their consulates in the United States to start burning all your secret documents. Why? Because as soon as the war started, they were going to lose that diplomatic immunity. They also revealed that Japanese spies in Hawaii were telling Japan, Tokyo, their capital, the exact locations of our ships and dock in Hawaii. Now, it's not unusual for a spy to watch ship movements, but when a spy is reporting the exact location of each ship, it's obvious they've been targeted for attack. Now, there was a Hollywood movie made back in the 60s called Tora, Tora, Tora. It was a very standard account of the Pearl Harbor attack. And in that movie, they show the U.S. Secretary of State, and that's the real Secretary of State at that time, Cordell Hull. In the movie, Cordell Hull meets with the Japanese ambassadors after the attack, and they present him with their declaration of war. In the movie, he's shocked and surprised. War has begun, you know. He can't believe it. In real life, he was not surprised. He already read the Japanese declaration of war, the translation of it, and it was going off. It's the day before that. 13 parts of that 14-part message, as had the President of the United States. Now, Washington also knew through a lot of personal warnings. For example, Joseph Grew, our ambassador to Japan, told the President in 1941 that he heard from sources in Japan that Japan was going to attack Pearl Harbor with all its strength and force if relations were to worsen. J. Edgar Hoover was the director of the FBI then. According to eyewitness testimony, he warned the President about the attack based on information he got from a European double agent named Dusko Popov. The Germans thought he was working for them, but he was actually working for us. He told Hoover about the attack. Hoover told the President. You can see Popov interviewed in that British documentary I mentioned. In that documentary, you'll also see interviewed U.S. Brigadier General Elliot Thorpe. He was the U.S. military observer on the island of Java, which was then under the control of the Dutch. That's out in the Pacific. The Dutch had also learned of the Pearl Harbor attack. They warned General Thorpe. He thought it was so urgent, he sent a total of 4 messages to Washington, until finally Washington sent back a reproof saying, send us no more messages concerning Pearl Harbor. Colonel F.G.L. Weigerman was a Dutch military attaché in Washington at that time. He has testified he notified our Army Chief of Staff, George Marshall, of the attack, and Senator Guy Gillette and Congressman Martin Dies both received information about the attack. Each man met with President Roosevelt, and in each case the President said, don't take this message to anybody else, this information to anybody else, just leave it in my hands, the President's hands. Now, 2001, Disney produced this movie, Pearl Harbor, starring Ben Affleck, very standard rendering of the Pearl Harbor attack, and it shows President Roosevelt shocked once again by the attack. And so in answer to that, the New American asked me to write a new 16-page article on Pearl Harbor, and we actually had more information at this point because former Navy man Robert Stinnett had written this book, Day of Deceit. Using the Freedom of Information Act, he's able to prove something we never knew before, which is that Washington had not only translated Japan's diplomatic messages, it also cracked Japan's naval code. Now, for a long time, people thought that when the Japanese fleet was approaching Hawaii, they maintained total radio silence. They didn't. They were discreet, they didn't talk much, they did send out some radio messages, and the most important one which we were intercepting, was this one. Admiral Yamamoto was the commander of the fleet. Admiral Yamamoto to Japanese First Air Fleet, November the 26th, 1941. The task force, keeping its movement strictly secret and maintaining close guard against submarines and aircraft, shall advance into Hawaiian waters, and upon the very opening of hostilities shall attack the main force of the United States fleet and deal it a mortal blow. The first air raid is planned for the dawn of X day. Exact date is to be given by later order. Now, no American reading that message could possibly mistake its meaning. By the way, I'd like to mention that after all this information came out, Congress did pass a resolution exonerating Kimmel in short of any wrongdoing at Pearl Harbor, and also received a very nice letter from the son of General Short, Colonel Walter C. Short. He was only retired for the articles we did in the New American. We're also contacted by the attorney for the Kimmel family, which has been trying for years to exonerate Admiral Kimmel, and they requested permission to use one of our New American articles in that effort. Now, kicking it back to World War I, there are different things that got the United States into World War I, but does anybody know what the most inflammatory incident was? It was the sinking of a passenger ship called the Lusitania. Now, at this time, I mean, you can read about that in your history books. At this time, America was not yet in the First World War, but Britain was fighting Germany, and the British wanted to get us into that war. Now, this British passenger ship was on its way from New York to England, and there were a couple hundred Americans on board. And Americans were told that, you know, the Germans sank this boat just to kill a lot of innocent women and children. This really inflamed passions, you know, here in America. But that's not the real reason that the Germans sank it. They sank it because loaded with munitions, all kinds of shells and cartridges in its hull. And they were trying to stop that material from getting to England, where it could be used to kill German soldiers in the war. Everybody who survived that disaster said there were 2 explosions. With this one torpedo fired, and the ship went down in 18 minutes, right? The first explosion was the torpedo hitting. The second explosion, the munitions were detonating. Very significant also was this. Winston Churchill was at that time head of the British Admiralty. He was head of their Navy. He had ordered a study to be done determining what the political impact would be if a British passenger ship were sunk by the Germans with Americans on board. Commander Joseph Kenworthy was then in British Naval Intelligence, and he wrote this. Sorry, I skipped on there. He said the Lusitania was deliberately sent at considerably reduced speed into an area where a U-boat was known to be waiting with their escorts withdrawn. Now, how could the British know where a U-boat was known to be waiting? Well, they had cracked Germany's naval codes at that time, and through breaking those codes, plus the activity of this U-boat, the U-20, they knew where it was. Let me back up to that other quote. Those exchanges took place between Lord Grey, the British Foreign Minister, and Edward Mandell House was top advisor to our President, President Wilson. Grey asked this question: what will America do if the Germans sink an ocean liner with American passengers on board? And House replied, I believe that a flame of indignation and anger, right, would sweep the United States, and not by itself would be sufficient to carry us into the war. Now, you know, here in America, there was an official inquiry into the sinking of the Lusitania. And at that inquiry, the officials who were conducting it were not allowed to see the original ship's manifest that listed all the munitions on board. They just were given a dummy manifest, and the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson, ordered the original manifest be hidden in the archives of the United States Treasury so that no one would know. Now, if you want to read more about this, there's books about it, like The Lusitania by British historian Colin Simpson, and Room 40 by Patrick Beasley. Now, he's the world's greatest authority on the history of British naval intelligence. He used to be in British naval intelligence, and here's what he writes in his book. I am reluctantly driven to the conclusion that there was a conspiracy to put the Lusitania at risk, in hopes that even an abortive attack on her would bring the United States into the war. Now, Spanish-American War, I'm supposed everybody knows what the incident was about the Spanish-American War. Well, what your history books will tell you, and this is true, it was the sinking of the battleship Maine. It's a beautiful new battleship, and it sailed into Havana Harbor, which was then under the control of Spain, and it blew up a few days later. Just the whole ship massively torn apart, and 266 crew members lost their lives, as most of the crew. And right away, this was blamed on Spain, and you started to see headlines like this in America. Crisis at hand, cabinet session, growing belief in Spanish treachery. McKinley, that was our president, suspicious of Spanish plot. So we went to war, and the battle cry was, remember the Maine and to hell with Spain. There's been different documentaries which now have said that the original findings of the United States about an external device, blood Maine, were wrong. That appears to have been an internal device. But the main thing I want to point out, because I'm writing an article right now on the Spanish-American War for the New American, is that Spain had absolutely no motive to do this. They did not want to go to war with us. They were bending over backwards to avoid a war. We had a modern steel navy. They had old wooden battleships that couldn't possibly stand up to our navy. The last thing they wanted was a war with America. We started with Pearl Harbor in 1941. We started to move towards present time. 1950, the Korean War started, and that started when Kim Il-sung, the communist dictator of North Korea, ordered his troops to invade South Korea, the Free South. Here's a trivia question almost nobody knows the answer to. How did this guy Kim Il-sung, the dictator of North Korea, how did him and the communists come to power in North Korea in the first place? Almost never, oh, well, somebody knows.
No, I'm just guessing. I'm just guessing. I don't know, but I'm just guessing.
What'd you guess?
Was it the Russians or the Chinese?
Well, the Russians had a sort of a hand in it, but actually it was our own policy that brought them into power, and here's how it happened. During World War II, Joseph Stalin, I mentioned him last night, he was a dictator of the Soviet Union, a bad guy, killed tens of millions of his own people. But the Russians were our allies against the Germans during World War II. But Stalin was not fighting the Japanese like we were. He had a peace pact with Japan. Now you might have heard of the Big Three conferences, Tehran and Yalta, where Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt and Stalin got together. Now, at the Big Three conferences, President Roosevelt asked Stalin, will you break your peace pact against Japan? And Stalin said, sure, I'll break it, but only on one condition. I want the United States to supply me with all the tanks, all the planes, all the jeeps, all the weapons I'll need to make this attack on Japan. And Roosevelt agreed, and 600 shiploads of what they call Lend-Lease supplies were sent to Russia expressly for this attack on Japan. But when did Stalin wait to attack the Japanese? 5 days before Japan surrendered. His troops never had to fire a shot. Now here come his troops into China, allegedly to fight the Japanese. The Japanese just surrendered because the war was over. They were able to pick up all those Russian weapons. They gave those and their American weapons to the communists in China, and that's how China became communist. We were talking about Korea, though, right? What's the story on Korea? Well, Korea had been a colony of Japan. So what do you do with it after the war? Now, as we're going to see today, America's most powerful journal of foreign affairs, its most influential journal, is called Foreign Affairs. And in 1944, it published an article called Korea in the Post-War World. In this article, they proposed that Korea be divided into half, north and south. Same thing we did to Germany, right? We divided Germany to east and west. The Russians got the east, and we took the west. And they said we should divide Korea in half. We'll take the south, and our noble, gallant Soviet communist allies, they can get the north. And that's what happened. This was proposed to Stalin by Harry Truman at the Potsdam Conference, and naturally he accepted. In effect, the Russians were given control of North Korea as a reward for helping win the Pacific War when they didn't even fight in it. We were the ones who won it. Now, some people in response to this would say, hey, Mr. Perloff, you know, you just got to learn to chill out. You know, these guys who make our foreign policy decisions, they're just guys doing the best job they can, but sometimes they make mistakes. Mr. Perloff, you perfect? You're not? What a surprise. Well, neither the guys that make our foreign policy. There's a very simple explanation of what happened in Korea, which is that accidents do happen. But you know what? Before we write this off as an accident, I want to point out that this little accident cost over 50,000 American soldiers their lives in the Korean War, and it cost over 1 million Koreans their lives in that war. So before we just call it an accident, I'm going to quote somebody who didn't think it was an accident. That was the American Secretary of Defense back then, James Forrestal. James Forrestal has seen that there were certain people in our State Department, that's the department that deals with foreign affairs, but were consistently doing things that helped the Soviet Union and never America. And finally he said this. He said, look, consistency has never been a mark of stupidity. The diplomats who have mishandled our relations with Russia were merely stupid. They would occasionally make a mistake in our favor. Secretary Forrestal died on May the 22nd, 1949. You know how he died? He fell out of a window on the 16th floor, Bethesda Naval Hospital. But of course, some people have a way of explaining that too. Hey, you know, accidents happen. You know, the guy probably slipped on a banana peel and, you know, just took a header out the window. But if you want to do something interesting, you can read up on the death of James Forrestal. There was a guy in our government standing up to what was happening. But right now, we'll move on to the next American war, which is the Vietnam War. Now, younger people won't remember this, but what authorized the president to intervene in Vietnam with strong force is something called the Tonkin Gulf Resolution. Congress permitted the president to escalate the war, to bring it to a new height. And it was based upon an alleged attack on the U.S. Navy in the Gulf of Tonkin, outside of North Vietnam, on the night of August the 4th, 1964. Now, Admiral James Stockdale, recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor, was a pilot in the Tonkin Gulf at that time. And he overflew the scene of the alleged attack for 90 minutes. And then later on during the war, he was shot down. He spent 7 years in a hellish communist prisoner of war camp. He came home and he wrote his memoirs called An 11 War, which I have right here. And in this book, he revealed what really happened at the Tonkin Gulf. I'm just going to quote him here. I am going to pick it up from his return to the aircraft carrier, the Ticonderoga, which he'd flown from. Wheeling into the ready room, I'd hurriedly left 3 hours before. I came face to face with about 10 assorted ship's company, air group, and staff intelligence officers, all with sheepish grins on their faces. The mood was mirthful. Obviously, they had some big joke to tell me. What the hell's been going on out there, they laughingly asked. Damned if I know, I said. It's a flap. The guy in the Maddox, that's one of the U.S. destroyers, was giving blow-by-blow accounts. Turning left, turning right, torpedoes to the right of us, torpedoes to the left of us, boom, boom, boom. I got right down there once and shot at whatever they were shooting at. They come around towards the destroyers right on the deck, chasing some imaginary PT boat that was running up behind them. Did you see any boats? Not one. No boats, no boat wakes, no ricochets off boats, no boat gunfire, no torpedo wakes, nothing but Black Sea and American firepower. For goodness sakes, I must be going crazy. How could all that commotion be built up out there without something being behind it? Now, the next morning, Stockdale was awoken by a young officer. Who are you, I asked. I'm the junior officer of the deck, sir. Captain sent me down to tell you. We got a message from Washington telling us to prepare to launch strikes against the beach, sir. What's the idea of the strikes, I asked. Reprisal, sir. Reprisal for what? For last night's attack on the destroyers, sir. I flipped on my bed lamp, and the young officer left. I felt like I'd been doused with ice water. How do I get in touch with the president? He's going off half-cocked. We're about to launch a war under false pretenses. The fact that a war was being conceived out here in the humid muck of the Tonkin Gulf didn't bother me so much. But for the long pull, it seemed to me important that the grounds for entering war be legitimate. I felt it was a bad portent, a bad sign, that we seem to be under the control of a mindless Washington bureaucracy, vain enough to pick their own legitimacies, regardless of evidence. Unquote. Admiral James Stockdale, recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor. By the way, it was eventually proven that the Tonkin Gulf Resolution was written before the incident even took place. Finally, the war in Iraq. Kind of a sensitive topic since it's still going on, or remnants of it are still going on. Just want to say one thing about it. You know, today we're being told that the purpose of the war in Iraq has been to create freedom and democracy for the Iraqi people. You know, that's not what we were told before this war began. We're told it's all about weapons of mass destruction. Before the war began, the United States Secretary of State, Colin Powell, went before the United Nations and said he had absolute proof of weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. He said, my colleagues, every statement I make today is backed up by sources, solid sources. These are not assertions. We were giving you our facts and conclusions based on solid intelligence. And President Bush told the American people, Saddam Hussein and his weapons are a direct threat to this country, to our people, and to all free people. Will not leave the American people at the mercy of the Iraqi dictator and his weapons. But after long inspecting, David Kay, the chief U.S. weapons inspector, said that no weapons of mass destruction could be found in Iraq. And he said, in his opinion, they had never existed since the first Gulf War of 1991. And Colin Powell finally acknowledged that what he said before the UN was based upon faulty intelligence. Now, take a look at these 6 wars: Spanish-American, World War I, World War II, Korea, Vietnam, and Iraq. You can make a pretty good case that our involvement in each of these wars was based upon some sort of deception or a false pretext, or to give it a more charitable look, a mistaken pretext. Now, is there another common denominator behind these 6 wars? Yes, it can be said that the same group of men were behind or involvement in each of these wars. Now, if I heard that, now some of you, I would say something like this: Mr. Perloff, are you nuts? I hate to inform you this, dude, but don't you think that the guys behind the Spanish-American War will be kind of like dead now? So like, how could they be behind the war in Iraq? Well, I'm talking about a group that survives through the generations. And there's many groups like that, right? For example, the Communist Party. You know, communism got kicked off in 1848 when Marx and Engels released their books, right? But 100 years later, long after they're dead, the communists took power in China. There's millions of Republicans in America today, but the founders of the party go back to Abe Lincoln, they're all dead now. The Christian church goes back a couple thousand years. The mafia, they say, goes back centuries. I'm talking about a group like that. As older members are dying off, younger members are coming in. So what group am I talking about? Well, when I was a hippie back in 1970, that is not me, but I used to hang out with guys who look just like that. Hippies used to like to say, you know, man, it's really the establishment that's running this country. What do they mean by that? They meant that, hey, there's a bunch of rich guys who really call the shots in this country. You know what? I actually do agree with that. But what I disagree with hippies on is how they characterize the establishment. They thought that the establishment was conservative, anti-communist, patriotic, and Christian. And it was kind of like the John Birch Society, only they had a lot more money. A pretty good definition of establishment was written by the granddaughter of Teddy Roosevelt, Edith Kermit Roosevelt. She was a syndicated newspaper columnist. She said this: the word establishment is a general term for the power elite in international finance, business, and government who wield most of the power regardless of who's in the White House. Most people are unaware of the existence of this legitimate mafia. Yet the power of the establishment makes itself felt from the professor who seeks a foundation grant to the candidate for a cabinet post or State Department job. It affects the nation's policies in almost every area. I'm going to underscore two things she said here. International finance, because as we'll see today, these guys are tied into Wall Street. And regardless of who's in the White House, because to these guys, they don't care if the president is Republican or Democrat, they will still call the shots. Now, some people would say this, Mr. Perloff, you know what you're talking about. Dude, don't you know? In our country, we have government of the people, by the people, and for the people. Let's face it, the people have all the power. Look, we the people put these guys in office through our votes, so obviously the voters have the power. And anything these guys do in office just must be a reflection of our own will. You know what, Mr. Perloff? If we don't like what our leaders are doing, it's very simple. We just kick them out the next election. So you see all this stuff about some sinister power behind the throne. That's a bunch of baloney. Well, you know what? I agree that in principle, power is supposed to belong to the people, but I don't think they're holding that much power at this point in America. See, the power elite have figured out that they can pretty much predetermine who the two major presidential candidates will be for either party before the election even happens. And my focus is not elections today, but I want to back that up a little bit. Now, Jimmy Carter was elected president in 1976. There's a trivia question. 7 months before the nominating convention, the Democratic National Convention, what percentage of registered Democrats wanted this guy as president? I wouldn't expect you to know the answer, but the answer is less than 4%. Most people never even heard of Jimmy Carter. But all of a sudden, he became the candidate. And how did that happen? Well, here's how it happened. He got invited to dinner at the home of David Rockefeller, who they call kingmaker of the establishment. And also president at that meeting was Zbigniew Brzezinski, who Carter later made his national security advisor. Let me just quote what the conservative Senator Barry Goldwater said about this meeting between these three. He said, David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski found Jimmy Carter to be their ideal candidate. They helped him win the nomination and the presidency. To accomplish this purpose, they mobilized the power of the Wall Street bankers and the media controllers. Let me flesh that in a little bit. Before the nominating convention took place, Carter's picture appeared on the cover of Time 3 times, the cover of Newsweek twice. New York Times suddenly ran a series of pieces puffing and promoting Jimmy Carter. The Wall Street Journal said of all the candidates, he'd be the best next president of the United States, of all the Democratic candidates. And the three big networks, TV networks back then, ABC, CBS, NBC, started inundating the American public with images of Jimmy Carter every night. So guess what? When the nominating convention came around, he got it. But was it because all across America, Democrats independently decided that Jimmy Carter was their man, or was it because he was picked in a high place and then packaged and sold to the people? With respect, I suggest that that was what happened, and that that's what's happened to most of our major party candidates over the last century. But elections are not my focus today. The establishment has another way of influencing American policy and the president, and that's a bridge of influence called the Council on Foreign Relations, which is the subject of my book, The Shadows of Power. And what's the, how do they do this? Well, I'm going to talk about that. But first, let me just talk about what is the goal of the Council on Foreign Relations. And to establish that, I'm going to quote a former member, Admiral Chester Ward, former judge advocate of the U.S. Navy. He was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, CFR for short, for 16 years before he resigned in disgust. He said, the main purpose of the Council on Foreign Relations is promoting the disarmament of U.S. sovereignty and national independence and submergence into an all-powerful one-world government. I lived down in Boston, and even the Boston Herald, which used to be pretty conservative, they had an editorial on the CFR, and they said that it consists of foreign policy fuzzy thinkers who worship world government. Now, in the book, you can find a lot more quotes to back this up. But what would a world government be? Just to define our terms. A world government would be a single government ruling the whole world. And of course, that's not what we have today, right? The government of Japan rules Japan, the government of Brazil rules Brazil. So some people might think, Mr. Perloff, that never happened in a million years. Actually, it's happening right now on a local, regional scale in Europe. Every year, the countries of Europe are losing more and more sovereignty to the European Union, which is taking control. You know, they've consolidated their currencies into the euro. They're talking about having a European Pentagon. The European Union has its own ambassadors worldwide. They're going to have a European constitution. This is a world government on a local level. And as we'll see, they're planning the same thing for North America. Now again, Foreign Affairs is the journal of the Council on Foreign Relations. And I went through every issue before I wrote my book. And I found all kinds of quotes supporting world government. To go back to the very first issue, Philip Carr, the big advocate of world government, said, obviously, there's going to be no peace or prosperity for mankind so long as it remains divided into 50 or 60 independent states. The real problem today is that of world government. Now, this is 1922, he said that. They're still saying the same thing today. And they love this phrase, peace and prosperity. You always see them use that, you know. See, they say this. They say, well, what's the worst thing in the world? War, right? And the only reason we have war is because the world's divided into different countries. Now, if we just got rid of the different countries and erased all the national boundaries, we'd live in brotherhood and have peace and prosperity. But contradicting that is this guy. This is Rudolph Rummel's professor of political science at the University of Hawaii. And he did a study of death in the 20th century. You know what he found? He found that 4 times more people in the 20th century were killed by their own governments than war. In other words, government is more dangerous than war is. Now, you have a world government. One of the questions is, who's going to run this thing? Now, the world government advocates love to say, well, you know, look at all the good that international coalitions have done. A coalition stopped Hitler, a coalition stopped Saddam Hussein. Okay, what happens if a Saddam Hussein type runs your world government? If you have one government, where can you run to hide? You know, the Founding Fathers understood you never put all power in one place. You never put it in one place. So you know this, but they give us an executive branch, a legislative branch, a judicial branch. And granted, there's been corruption at times in all of those branches, but the division of powers keeps us from dictatorship. And by the way, in their original vision, the states were supposed to be strong enough to counterbalance the force of the federal government. The father of the Constitution, that's what they call him, James Madison, said, the accumulation of all power in the same hands may be pronounced the very definition of tyranny. So if you had all power in one single government, that would be the worst tyranny you can imagine. So that's part 1 of my talk. I'm going to do part 2, then we'll take a break. Okay. This Council on Foreign Relations, how did it get started? It got started right after World War I, when President Woodrow Wilson, the guy on the right, went to the Paris Peace Conference, which was settling the aftermath of the war. And always at his side was his top advisor, Edward Mandell House. House was a front man for Wall Street, and he was called by his official biographer the unseen guardian angel of the Federal Reserve Act. He lived right in the White House and oversaw Wilson's every move. Now, it might not be too surprising that a plan for world government will be linked to Wall Street, because what do we say? Don't we say that money makes the world go round, you know, in human terms? And we want to know who's behind something. We say, follow the money, right? So let's follow the money and see what and who is behind the Council on Foreign Relations. I'm going to be talking about money a little bit, and you might think, well, what's this got to do with the wars and stuff you're talking at the beginning? Well, you know, there's a definite link between the banking and the Wall Street and the foreign policy. and we're just going to talk about the banking for a little bit, and eventually the connection will be clear. Now, your parents appreciate this better than you can, but we have rising prices in this country. I just want to go back in time to when I was a little boy, 1962, a candy bar was a nickel. What is it today? What, 75 cents? Well, how much?
$1.
$1 now. Okay.
$1.25.
$1.25. Wow, I haven't bought one for a while, so that's why I don't know. A postage stamp today is 44 cents. At that time, it was 4 cents. You could buy a new pair of sneakers in for $5. A movie ticket was 50 cents. Tuition at Harvard that year was $1,520. Today it must be about, what, about $50,000. You could buy a new imported Renault automobile from France for $1,395. Today a new car might cost, you know, $20,000, $30,000. The average cost of a new house then was $12,500. Today you probably spend $200,000, $300,000, $400,000 depending on the house. Prices are rising, you know, and it seems like it's inevitable. People are told, hey, it's like death and taxes. You'll always have inflation and rising prices. You know what, it does look that way, because if you look at something called the Consumer Price Index, that's a measure of prices in America, it's gone up every year without exception for the last 50 years. So people think, oh, you're always going to have rising prices, but it's not true. They'll prove that right now. Wait a minute, before I do that, I haven't rehearsed this thing enough. How does the establishment explain inflation? They try to blame it on the American people. They say, here's the reason you have inflation. Some guy named Joe goes to his boss and he says, boss, my wife just had a baby. Could I have a raise of, say, $50 a week? And his boss says, well, Joe, you know, I'd like to give you a raise of $50 a week, but I can't afford it. The only way I can do that is by raising our costs, or our prices. We'll have to pass it on to the people we do business with. So the people that do business with Joe's company say, well, if you guys are raising your prices, we'll have to raise our prices. And all across America, prices go up because greedy Joe had a baby and asked for a raise. Joe and guys like him. That's the explanation that people are given in America. Well, the truth is that we have not always had inflation for America. This is a graph from Oregon State University. And I want you to take a look at this graph. For the first 250 years, this is from 1665, the days of the Pilgrims, till now. For the first 250 years in American history, there was zero net inflation. If you bought a pair of shoes in 1900, they would have cost you the same as they did back in the days of George Washington, 1770. Now, some people might object and say, well, it's not a flat line, Mr. Perloff, there's some blips in there. Yeah, in the early days there were some blips. And what were those blips? Those blips were wars. The Revolutionary War, War of 1812, and the Civil War. What happened during wars is the American government, to pay for the war, they would print money. And when you print money, money starts to lose its value.